Rapture becomes her. Chapter 5. The sound of approaching feminine voices alerted Barnaby to Mrs. Gilbert's return. Her gray hair caught up in a neat bun at the back of her head, a few girlish curls dangling near her cheeks. She hurried into the barn. "I must apologize, my lord, for not being here when you arrived," she said breathlessly when she reached him. "I thought I'd be back sooner." Flora accompanied her mother. "Good afternoon, my lord," she said with a dimpled smile and a quick curtsy. "Ma wasn't sure you would even come." An easy smile on his face, Barnaby said. "Refuse an invitation from your mother? After all, your kindness to me, what sort of a craven would that make me?" To Mrs. Gilbert, he said, "I've only been here a few minutes, and Caleb has taken very good care of me." Her eyes on the bald gelding, Mrs. Gilbert asked, "Is that your horse Blazer, boy?" "Faith swears that he is." Barnaby nodded. "Yes, that's Blazer, all right. I was driving him when I left London." He frowned. "How does she know him, and where did you find him?" Faith has loved horses all of her life and notices them, especially the fine ones like your Blazer there. Blazer was the old Viscount's favorite driving horse, and he used to drive him with his curricle all over the place. Your great uncle stopped here whenever he came to the village, and Faith was quite familiar with Blazer. She smiled. Blazer was a favorite of hers, too. As to where she found him, her smile vanished. She and Molly were coming back from Eastbourne and passed a horse trader with 6 or 7 horses in tow. Faith recognized Blazer right away. His face marking is quite intensive. When she stopped the man and demanded to know what he was doing with Viscount Jocelyn's horse, the fellow claimed innocence. Said he found him running loose several days ago, further up the coast. Mrs. Gilbert's lips thin. "I know horse traders, and from the hasty way he handed over Blazer to her without an argument or payment, I suspect there's more to the story, but Faith and Molly were alone, and they didn't want to question him too closely. Faith was just glad to get her hands on Blazer. It seems my debt to your family is only increasing," Barnaby said. Mrs. Gilbert snorted. "As long as you keep your tongue behind your teeth about certain events you observed the other night, you owe us nothing." "What things?" Barnaby asked, with big-eyed innocence. Mrs. Gilbert chuckled. "I see we understand each other. Now come along. I'm sure you want to question Faith about the horse trader yourself." "I'm sorry, my lord," Faith told Barnaby when he asked her to describe the horse trader to him. "I didn't pay him any mind." A faint flush rose in her cheeks. "All my interest was in Blazer, and I was more concerned about getting my hands on him than a horse trader. Beyond being a stranger, there's not much else you can tell me about him?" "I think he was an older man," she offered, trying to be helpful. Her pretty blue eyes distressed, she said unhappily, "I'm sorry." Molly, who had accompanied Faith to Eastbourne, had little more to add to her sister's tale. Barnaby did a swift examination of Blazer, and beyond having lost a small amount of weight and having a slight cut on one shoulder, he appeared in fine shape. Temporarily leaving the horse in the stall, he walked with Mrs. Gilbert and Flora to the inn. Mrs. Gilbert and her lively daughters provided good company, and he had the opportunity to meet some of the locals. After having introduced him to a few fishermen and laborers drinking ale at the long counter, her expression bland, Mrs. Gilbert marched him over to a table where a young gentleman in military garb sat alone. "My lord, allow me to introduce Lieutenant Daring. He is our local riding officer. She smiled grimly. Lieutenant Darren has been sent here to stamp out all those nasty smugglers that abound in the area. Darren flushed, and Barnabelle felt sorry for him. "Revenue Service, are you?" he asked in a friendly voice, as the lieutenant rose to his feet to meet him. "Yes, my lord," Darren replied, standing almost at attention. Barnaby liked the look of him, brown-haired and of a medium build with intelligent blue eyes. From the neatness of his attire, it was clear he took his job seriously and had not fallen into the sloven ways of some of the men in the revenue service. "Do you mind if I join you?" Astonished at being singled out, the young officer stammered, "If you wish, my lord, I'd be honored." As Barnabas sat and drank a tankard of ale with the young man, he was aware of the narrow-eyed glances sent their way. It wasn't an easy job the lieutenant faced, forced to live amongst the very people he was trying to apprehend. Barnaby imagined that most of the locals treated Darren with suspicion and wariness. Certainly none of them would have joined him in drinking a tankard of ale. "A thankless task you have," Barnaby said. David nodded. "I'll not pretend otherwise, or that half my men are being bribed to look the other way," he sighed. "But I took on the job, and I mean to uphold the law, even if it makes me an unpopular man around here, and my own men think I'm a fool for trying to stop the smuggling." They conversed for a few minutes longer, and finishing his ale, Barnaby rose to his feet and said, "I do not envy your task, but I wish you well in it," provided, he thought to himself as he walked away. "You stay away from Mrs. Gilbert and Miss Emily." Barnaby was taking his leave of Mrs. Gilbert when an old fisherman, his dark hair grizzled and his face worn and burned by the elements, wandered in and settled at a small round table in the far corner of the oak-beamed room. Mrs. Gilbert spied the newcomer and said to Barnaby, "That's Jed Brown." "The man who pulled me from the channel?" Mrs. Gilbert nodded. Barnaby walked to the table where Jed Brown sat and said quietly, "Mr. Brown, I am Lord Jocelyn. Mrs. Gilbert tells me that you saved my life the other night." "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "A mere thank you seems a scant reward for what you did. If there is anything I can do—" Jeb stood up and cautiously took the hand Barnaby stretched out. "Truth is, my lord, I thought you was dead when I pulled you on board," Jeb said. "Almost jumped out of my boots when you groaned, and I found you was alive." He studied Barnaby a long moment, then said meaningfully, "As long as you prove to be a good friend to Mrs. Gilbert and them girls of hers, that's thanks enough for me." Barnaby inclined his head in perfect understanding. "None of you have anything to fear from me." His eyes met Jeb's. "It would be an honor to be considered your friend, and should you ever have need of my friendship, you know where to find me." Sharp gray eyes studied him a moment longer. Then Jeb nodded. "Thank you, my lord. I'll remember that, and take you at your word." With Blazer following on the lead rope behind his horse, Barnaby rode away from the inn. The weather was worsening, and he noted that during the time he'd been inside that the skies had darkened to a surly gray and that the wind had picked up. The scent of rain was in the air, and dusk wasn't far away. Not liking the idea of fighting his way home through unfamiliar territory in darkness and rain, Barnaby kicked the black into a fast trot, Blazer responding obediently to the quickened pace. Not more than a mile later, the first raindrops fell. Within minutes, Barnaby and the horses were drenched, and an ugly wind nipped at them, adding to the general discomfort. Cursing himself for not paying attention to the time and weather, he spurred his horse to a faster clip, Blazer keeping pace behind the black. It was a miserable, wet, and cold ride. Barnaby was delighted when he recognized a strangling row of beech trees and realized that he was just over a mile from Windmere. Around the next bend lay the entrance to Windmere, and once he traversed the half-mile or so of driveway that led to the great mansion, warmth and shelter waited him. Intent on reaching his goal, he rounded a broad bend in the road at a dead gallop. Without warning, his horse skidded to a halt and reared in fright, nearly throwing him from the saddle. Blazer, from behind, shied and snorted, and shuddered to a halt at the side of the road alongside Barnaby's plunging horse. Bringing his mount under control and keeping Blazer on the shorter leg, Barnaby reached for what had frightened his horse and crossed it to rear. Through the blowing rain, on the opposite side of the road, he spied a small black buggy leaning drunkenly in the ditch. The woman driver, concentrating on convincing her horse to move, hadn't noticed Barnaby and his horses. As he slowly angled across the road and walked his horses toward the buggy, the driver gently urged the horse forward, and the little animal made a valiant effort, plunging against the breaststrap of the harness. Beyond a rocking motion, the buggy didn't move. "It's no use, Emily," the woman cried. "I'm afraid she's lame." From behind the buggy, a feminine voice answered, "Blast it! I cannot judge the way by myself. It is mired too deeply in the mud. Hell and damnation." "Oh, Emily, you know you shouldn't swear like that," scolded the driver. "What if someone should hear you?" "Bloody hell, I wish there was someone to hear," Emily said bitterly. "At least we have help." Barnaby's lips twitched. The name in the voice identified the hidden speaker, Emily Townsend. Suddenly he was no longer worried about being wet and cold, or in such a hurry to reach home. Unaware of Barnaby's presence, Emily said fiercely, "I'll strangle that wretch Kelsey if I ever lay eyes on him again. He deliberately ran us off the road, and if he's caused real damage to Sonny, I'll have his liver." Barnaby near the buggy, and trying not to startle the occupant, he called out softly, "Hello, I am Lord Jocelyn of Windmere. May I be of service to you?" The rain and the deep shadows created by the curved top of the buggy didn't allow him to see much, but as the driver looked in his direction, he was left with the instant impression of very large dark eyes and a pretty face. "Oh," the driver exclaimed, "I didn't see you. Emily, come quick, someone is here." From behind the buggy, a tall female form appeared and nimbly climbed nimbly onto the road and stalked toward him. The hood of her mud-stained cloak hid her features from him, but Barnaby was certain, even without having heard her name or her voice, that he would have recognized a challenge set to the head and shoulders in the defiant stride of his boy, who was not a boy. Stopping in front of his horse, Emily recognized the big man immediately and decided that fate hated her. Lord Jocelyn, how bloody wonderful! She knowing they meet again, and while she hadn't wasted time thinking about him, she hoped when their paths next crossed it would be under more flattering conditions. But no, she thought acidly. She had to be wearing her oldest clothes, much flatter, now after her fight with the recalcitrant Will, and she was soaked to the skin. Hoping he didn't connect her to the youth at the end, Emily said coolly, "I am Emily Townsend. My cousin Geoffrey Townsend is the local squire." Indicating the driver with a wave of her arm, she added, "This is my stepmother, Mrs. Ann Townsend." Some imp pushed her to ask, "And you are?" Squashing the urge to laugh, he replied, "As I told your stepmother, I am Lord Jocelyn." A mocking gleam in the blackness and the black eyes, he added, "And I'm sure you know that I live at Windmere." "It is a pleasure to meet you, my lord," said Anne hastily. She smiled shyly. even in such uncomfortable circumstances. Swinging from his saddle, Barnaby said, I think the circumstances are rather providential, don't you? Holding on to the reins and Blazer's lead rope in one hand, ignoring Emily, he bent down and examined the mare hitched to the buggy. A long jagged cut along her rear leg was steeped in blood, but it didn't appear to be deep or dangerous. A good cleaning and a stitch or two and some rest in the horse would be fine, but the little chestnut mare was decidedly lame, and if he was any judge, was not going to be pulling the buggy out of the ditch tonight. Ignoring the rein, he asked Emily, How far do you have to travel? Only about 4 miles. Testedly, she added, If you would help us feed the wheel, we can be on our way. He looked at the horse, the obviously wet and miserable woman before him, and the small huddled driver, and made a decision. Windmere is less than a mile away. It will be far better if you take refuge there for the time being. He thought a second and aware of the treacherous roads, added, Once you are warm and dry, I shall send you home in one of my carriages. Meanwhile, your horse can be stable and seen to. She is welcome to remain in my stables until her lameness is gone. Oh, thank you, my lord, exclaimed Anne, before Emily could say a word. Sunny is a good little mare, and will do her best to get us home, but I fear we might cause her great harm. You are too kind to not only shelter us, but to think of our dear Sunny too. And when Emily remained silent, she prodded gently. Don't you agree that it is very kind of his lordship, Emily? Emily didn't know why she was so reluctant to accept his offer, or why he aroused the contrary urge within her to do just the opposite of what he proposed. It was a sensible solution, and if it had been anyone else other than Lord Jocelyn, she wouldn't have thought twice about accepting his hospitality. Ashamed and a little surprised by the stubborn desire to defy him simply because of who he was, Emily muttered, Yes, it is very kind. Since that is settled, Barnaby said, I think for your mare's sake that it would be better if my Blazer were harnessed to your buggy. He's an excellent driving horse, and I suspect he will be able to free the wheel by himself. He got no argument from Emily. She knew Blazer of old, and she was more worried about Sunny than she cared to admit. Having a common goal, Emily and Barnaby worked quickly together, and in minutes Blazer was in harness and Sunny, her head hanging low, was stamping at the side of the road, wearing Blazer's large halter and lead rope. At Anne's command, Blazer leaned into the harness and with one powerful lunge freed the wheel and pulled the buggy back onto the roadway. Emily squeaked, and Barnaby's hands closed around her narrow waist, and he tossed her into the buggy beside Anne. Flustered and breathless, she stammered, Thank you. He grinned at her, his teeth gleaming in the shadows. Entirely my pleasure. After mounting his horse, holding Sunny's lead rope, he looked at the two women in the buggy and said, You go on ahead and alert my butler that I shall be arriving shortly behind you. He glanced back at the men. Your Sonny and I shall travel a bit more slowly. His thoughtfulness toward the man touched Emily, and her voice far warmer than it had been so far. She said, Thank you, my lord. I'm very sorry we are causing you such inconvenience. It is my pleasure, Miss Townsend. Now being on your way, I shall be right behind you. Barnaby with Sonny in tow arrived at Windermere 10 minutes after the ladies. By the time Barnaby rode out of the darkness and into the flickering light from the torches at the front of the house, both women had already been whisked inside of Peckham. Of Blazer and the buggy, there was no sign, and he assumed, rightly, that they had been taken to the stables. A pair of stable boys waited under the magnificent porch from him, and ran out into the rain to take both horses from him the instant he dismounted. Inside the grand foyer, Peckham and Tilden hovered like lightning bugs around him. "The ladies are upstairs in the blue bedroom," Beckham said, taking Barnaby's soaked greatcoat. "Mrs. Bartlett is singing to their knees." He hesitated. "I thought perhaps it would be easier if they were served in the morning room, rather than the formal dining room." Barnaby nodded. "Excellent choice. If they are down before I am, tell them not to wait for me. I doubt any of us wish to stand on ceremony tonight. I have warned Lamb that you would be arriving any moment, and would be in need of a change of clothing," chimed in Tilden. He coughed behind his hand. "I took the liberty of sending one of the footmen to the breeches with a note explaining the lady's delay, and warned John Coachman to have the smaller coach ready for travel tonight." Nodding his approval, Barnaby took the marble steps two at a time, and upon reaching his rooms, the instant the door shut behind him, began stripping off his wet clothes. His cravat, jacket, and shirt had been discarded by the time he strode into the dressing room. Lamb awaited him, and as he continued stripping, Barnaby related the events of the afternoon. A brisk rub with a towel, and he was stepping into the pair of breeches Lamb handed him, and a second later slipping into a fine linen shirt, both mercifully dry and warm. "I saw the two ladies as I came up the stairs," Lamb said idly, but the expression in his azure eyes was anything but idle. "A sprite and an Amazon," he continued. "Which one has caught your fancy?" "Neither," Barnaby replied, tucking in his shirt. Considering the situation, offering them shelter seemed the gentlemanly thing to do. "And that's all that prompt your actions? Politeness?" Barnaby grinned at him. "Why, what else could it have been?" Lamb snorted and handed him a freshly laundered cravat. "There is certainly a bevy of females in your life lately. First those Gilbert women, and now these two damsels. Happenstance, but don't forget I owe the Gilberts a huge debt, not only for nursing me, but now they've helped me recover Blazer." Watching critically as Barnaby hastily tied his cravat in a simple arrangement, Lamb asked, "Do you believe this faith story that she just happened to find your horse in the hands of a horse trader?" Barnaby glanced over his shoulder. "It makes sense. I think whoever tried to murder me sold Blazer at a bargain price to the horse trader, and I don't doubt that my gig is in various pieces scattered between here and London, or has been repainted and refurbished and is being driven around London by a new owner thrilled with the exceptional buy he made. So to answer your question, yes, I believe Faith's story." His eyes gleamed. "You're not yet had the privilege of meeting any of the Gilberts. I think you will find Mrs. Gilbert impressive and her daughters charming. You trust them?" Barnaby nodded as he sat down and began pulling on a pair of gleaming black boots. "I do." Standing up, he shrugged into the bottle green jacket with brass buttons that Lamb handed him. Excuse me. "Since you seem to doubt my judgment," he added with a grin, "you should meet them and form your own opinion." Following Barnaby as he walked from the room, Lamb muttered, "I intend to do just that." The previous squire and the seventh Viscount had been good friends, and both Anne and Emily had been frequent visitors to Windmere. Aware of the many grand rooms housed with the huge mansion, and despite having repaired the worst of the damage from their order, feeling worn and bedraggled, both ladies were relieved when Peckham showed them into the morning room. A cheery fire burned on the old brick hearth, and the soft shades of the rugs and chintz-covered furnishings created a cozy atmosphere. A teapot and a silver urn full of hot coffee sat at one end of the golden oak sideboard, and several plates covered with a variety of meats, cheese, breads, pickles, and relishes were laid out along its length. An oyster stew, prepared for Milord's return this evening, filled a big tureen at the opposite end of the sideboard. Peckham hovered over them. After seating them at the table and pouring cups of coffee, he filled 2 bowls of oyster stew, placed them with a flower before the women. Without asking their preferences, he piled 2 plates high with items from the sideboard, set them on the table. He would have continued to wait on them, but longing to be left alone, Emily said firmly, "Thank you, we can see to ourselves." He bowed and murmured, "If you are sure?" "No, thank you," Anne said politely. "We'll be fine." After he left, 2 women exchanged glances. "I must say he seems very efficient," Anne said kindly. "I much prefer Bissell," Emily said, taking a sip of coffee. "He is a dear man, isn't he?" Anne said. "I still don't understand why Matthew thought he should be replaced after his great uncle died. I would have thought that should have been their new heir's decision. You forget Matthew thought he was the heir, and it wasn't Matthew who suggested that Bissell retired, it was Thomas." Anne frowned slightly. "Isn't Thomas the middle brother, or is he the youngest one? They all look so much alike I can never remember which one of the previous Viscount great-nephews is which. Tom is the middle one, Simon is the youngest, and my favorite," Emily answered. "Probably because he was kind to me when I was a child, and I used to tag after him when he and his brothers came to visit their great uncle. Matthew and Tom ignored me, but Simon," she smiled warmly. "Simon always stuck up for me." The Viscount walked into the room, and a smile still curving her lips. Emily glanced in his direction. Barnaby had known that he was intrigued by his boy, who was not a boy, but he was stunned by his visceral reaction when he caught his first real sight of Emily Townsend. Hair the color of moonlight framed an arresting face that made his heart throb like a war drum. She wasn't pretty, a part of him acknowledged but by God. He swore she was the most attractive woman he ever seen in his life. Her features were intensely feminine, yet strong and spirited, her jaw stubborn and her mouth too wide and true for full beauty. But he was only aware that he probably killed to feel those lips soften beneath his. And that smile filled him with a fervent zeal to do whatever it took to keep her looking at him precisely as she was at this moment. As the seconds passed, Emily's smile faded, and as her long, livid gray eyes widened and fixed on his, somehow a powerful and fierce spring to life lifted him. It was all he could do not to stride across the room and sweep her into a crushing embrace. Dazed, feeling as if he'd been harassed and not very pleased about it, Barnaby wrenched his gaze away and looked blankly at the small, dark-haired woman seated next to Emily, her pansy brown eyes smiling. Anne said, "My lord, we cannot thank you enough for your kindness." Anne's voice cleared his head, and putting aside his permitted response to Emily Townsend, he forced a smile and advanced into the room. Once more in command of himself, at least he hoped to hell he was, he said, "I trust that my staff has treated you well and seen to all your needs." "Indeed," replied Anne, "everyone has been most kind." Avoiding looking at Emily, yet vibrantly aware of her, he said to Anne, "But you've hardly touched your food. Isn't it to your liking? If you wish, I can have cook prepare something more to your liking." Emily heard their voices, but the sound was like bees buzzing around in her head. She was conscious of her surroundings, but the world had tipped on its axis the second her eyes had fallen upon Lord Johnson. She was dizzy. Her chest felt tight as she fought against an insane desire to leap to her feet and run as fast as she could. But which direction? She wondered faintly. To him or away from him? He was very tall, but so much bigger, darker, and formidable than she remembered. Entering the room, he dominated it, yet she could not drag her eyes away from the dark, harsh-featured face and those powerful shoulders and arms. He looked nothing like a Jocelyn, she thought stupidly. The Jocelyns were handsome, polished men. This man, she swallowed. This man looked like a savage, a brigade, and perfectly capable of swinging a woman up into his arms and carrying her away, to do what he willed. An odd sensation curled low in her stomach at the idea of being at his mercy. She buried her nose in her cup, taking a long swallow, pale and angry at her reaction to him. Good God, she didn't even like him. Through lower lids she judged him, trying to decide what there was about him that had the power to rock her world. He was not traditionally handsome, she decided, but he possessed an undeniable verity and unmistakable attractiveness that women would find hard to resist. Staring at that bold face, watching the mobile mouth as he smiled at Anne, and hearing the lazy drawl of his voice, she shivered. She was afraid of him. Emily realized with a start. Instinctively, she knew he wasn't a bully or a braggart like Geoffrey, or a parcel or a fox like Answorth, nor was he a dodden, if indifferent, man like her father. She thought of kindly. The Carl smiled, pottering about in his garden, and nearly laughed. Not Lord Jocelyn was nothing like Vicar smile. She glimpsed the arrogance of Matthew Jocelyn in him, but standing next to this man, Matthew would fade into the background. No heaven help her. Lord Jocelyn was like no man she had ever met in her life. Miss Townsend, are you all right? His words jolted her, and she looked up to realize that both her and Anne were staring at her. Emily, is something wrong? Asked Anne wearily. Lord Jocelyn has asked you twice if you're certain there's nothing else you need. Emily flushed. I'm sorry. I guess that I'm a trifle wool-headed after today's evenings. With an effort, she forced herself to look at him, her heart plunging right to her toes at the narrow expression in those black eyes. Her gaze dropped to her bowl of oyster stew. I'm fine, she said, and picking up her spoon battle. Doesn't this stew look delicious? I've always enjoyed Mrs. Easton's cooking. Barnaby looked surprised. You know my cook, Mrs. Easton? Oh, yes, Anne answered. Your Mrs. Easton and our cook, Mrs. Spaulding, are sisters, and our butler, Walker, is your housekeeper. Mrs. Bartlett's uncle, Bristol, who used to be the butler here, is married to Mrs. Bartlett's oldest sister. He shook his head. I have had a hard time just remembering everyone's name, much less that of their relatives. It must be difficult for you, Anne said sympathetically, being among strangers and in a different country than you were born. Not so different, and I have my man Lamb with me. He smiled at Anne. I'm adjusted, and at least the language is the same. Interested, Emily looked at him and asked, Do you think you like living in England? His gaze seemed to reach out and caress her, and he said softly, Since I have met you two charming ladies, I find that I am liking it more and more by the minute. Oh, that was prettily done, cried Anne, clapping her hands together in delight. I can hardly wait for you to meet Great Aunt Cornelia. She's going to flirt outrageously with you. Great Aunt Cornelia? Barnaby asked with a lifted brow. Despite the flutter in her chest that his look had caused, Emily couldn't help smiling as she pictured Cornelia's reaction to Lord Jocelyn. She'd have you dancing to the tune of her Pippin in no time, Emily said, a teasing gleam in her eyes. That's if she doesn't eat you for dinner, Anne added, grinning. At 89, she is a remarkable woman. She'll like you especially if you stand up to her. Having helped himself from the sideboard, he took a seat across from the ladies and motioning them to their food, joined them at the table. Conversation was scant and general, as everyone concentrated on the food, but Barnaby learned a great deal about the neighborhood during the course of the meal. Because Smythe grew the most exceptional roses, Anne informed him. Sir Michael, his house steward's father, was a dear old man. Mrs. Featherstone, widow of a wealthy landowner, was a darling but a great gossip with a quiver full of daughters to marry off, and by all means Emily warned, never buy a horse from Lord Broadfoot. I shall look forward to meeting all of them, Barnaby said untruthfully as they finished up their meal and settled back to enjoy a final cup of coffee. He looked rueful. I suspect it will be months before I meet all my neighbors, and even longer before I can put faces with names. I am not even familiar with the staff at Windmere, let alone my neighbors. Anne smiled kindly at him. I want to be at all surprised if Lord and Lady Broadfoot don't come to call soon. Her eyes twinkling, she murmured, Cornelia says that Lady Broadfoot is already planning a soiree to introduce you to the neighborhood. Her good friend Mrs. Featherstone has promised to help. Not that the Mrs. Featherstones has a quiver full of hopeful daughters? Barnaby asked, looking alarmed. The very same, Emily said, smiling. And there are 3 Broadfoot daughters. While you have been hiding away here at Windmere, the ladies of the neighborhood have been all at Twitter knowing that the American Lord Jocelyn was finally in residence. According to Cornelia, they have been badgering their husbands unmercifully to call upon you. Only a fast-fading sense of decency has kept them from your door. But I expect within the next day or two you will have callers, she giggled, and most of them with marriageable daughters. Barnaby groaned, and both women laughed. There was a tap on the door, and Peckham popped his head inside the room. My lord, he began, you have. Get out of my way, Peckham. Matthew Jocelyn said irritably from behind the butler. It will be a cold day in hell before my brothers and I have to be announced to our cousin. Well, that went well.